Welcome to the second of a two-part series of deer and deer management in New York State. If you missed our first webinar, we do have it recorded and it's available on our website, and we'll be giving information about the website a little bit later. Just wanted to introduce tonight's presenters. I'm Christy Sullivan. I work in the Department of Natural Resources at Cornell University in Cooperative Extension. I'm an Extension Associate there. We also have joining us Bill Seymour, who's an Extension Associate with the Human Dimensions Research Unit in the Department of Natural Resources. I'd like to thank our Cornell Cooperative Extension partners out in the counties. We have Stephen Lutter from CCE of Cayuga County in Aurora, New York, and he's hosting a site with an on-site location at Wells College, thanks to Marion Brown, who's also helping to make that happen. Thanks to Abe Botter, who's in Seneca County. He's in Waterloo, also hosting a group there. And to Sharon Anderson from Cooperative Extension Tompkins County, and Sharon's hosting a group in Trumansburg. Thanks also to our DEC partners that you heard from two of them, or actually three of them, last week. Art Kirsch, who's a big game biologist in the Bureau of Wildlife in Region 8, Courtney Lemire, who's a big game biologist in Region 7, and Jeremy Hurst, who is online to answer some questions at the end of the webinar last week. And Jeremy's located in the Albany office of DEC. Our other partners are the Human Dimensions Research Unit at Cornell, Dan Decker, who's Associate Director of the unit, Emily Pomerantz, who's a PhD candidate in our department. I'd like to thank Paul Curtis, who has some of the presentations that you can find on the webinar. You'll see were created and recorded by Paul. And thanks also to Stephanie Webb and Diane Carlton from DEC, who are hosting some groups in Syracuse and Cortland this evening. Just a little bit of information about WebEx for those of you who aren't familiar with WebEx and haven't used this format before. I'm recording this webinar for later viewing, so you'll be able to view it again if you'd like, or share it with others, and I will send the link to that recording to you sometime later this week. So please feel free to ask questions and make comments in the chat box. There's a bubble that says chat at the top of your screen. If you click on that, it opens the chat box and gives you the option to chat with either the host, who is me, or any of the presenters or panelists. So please, when asking questions this evening, if you would please just send all the questions to me, that would be great, and I'll be fielding the questions at the end of the webinar. You can type questions at any time during any of the presentations, but in the interest of time, we're going to hold off until the end and answer all questions at the end of the webinar. And although Courtney and Art are not presenting this evening, they will be available, as will Jeremy Hurst, to answer any questions that you may have remaining from last week, or for those of you who may have viewed the webinar online sometime this week and have had new questions, you can ask them at the end of this session. So tonight's webinar will include a presentation on the positive and negative impacts associated with deer. And then we're going to have a participant poll, so we're going to ask you all a few questions about deer impacts that you have experienced. It gives you the opportunity to share your experiences with others who are online this evening. And then we're going to have a presentation by Bill Seymour. He's going to present the results from the survey of residents in the Central Finger Lakes WMU aggregate. And then finally, we'll summarize and kind of wrap up, and I'll give you some information on some steps that you can take going forward if you're interested in receiving more information or participating further. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. Okay, so I'm going to start out this evening with a presentation on deer-related impacts, and I'll begin by defining what we mean when we talk about wildlife impacts. What does that mean, and specifically deer impacts? And I'll provide some general examples of deer-related impacts in New York. And then I'll discuss how wildlife managers and citizens with a stake in deer management can use the wildlife impacts concept as a focus for discussion about local deer management. So when thinking about the concept of wildlife impacts, it helps to contemplate what comes to mind when people think about the phrase wildlife management. What do people generally associate that with? And I know I, as well as other people, and I think it's human nature, I tend to go to certain actions, like improving habitat, informing and educating people about the issues, wildlife issues, controlling populations, enforcing laws, creating recreation opportunity, regulating land use, those types of things. And that's very common because people have a natural tendency to jump right to the means of achieving their goals. However, thinking of wildlife management as a set of actions, starting with the means of achieving goals instead of thinking about the goals themselves, does not really describe the underlying reasons for wildlife management. So starting with a more comprehensive definition can provide a better foundation for discussions about wildlife management generally and deer management in particular. So a good starting point is to begin discussions by thinking about management in generic terms. So what do we mean by the word management? And management is defined as deciding how to use resources to influence future conditions through deliberate, goal-focused actions. And the key to the definition is that actions are designed to achieve the goals or the desired outcomes. And now when you move from a generic definition to a specific definition, wildlife management can be defined as making decisions and taking actions to purposefully influence people, wildlife, and habitats to achieve impacts that are important to society. And those outcomes are generally conceptualized as impacts that are addressed by or created by management, generally some type of reduction of a negative impact or expansion of positive impacts that people are experiencing. And so the definition provided here really emphasizes the fundamentally human purpose of wildlife management. So the terms effects and impacts have a specific meaning in wildlife management. So effects are positive and negative outcomes produced by interactions among wildlife, people, and the land or habitat. Impacts, however, are just a subset of those effects or outcomes that are recognized and regarded by stakeholders as important enough to warrant management attention. So there may be a lot of effects that deer have, but the impacts are those that are serious, fairly serious effects. And when we think about deer, there are a number of different impact categories that we think about, things that people have identified in the past or regularly come up when speaking about deer impacts. And those can include sociological impacts, the psychological impacts, health and safety impacts, economic impacts, and ecological impacts. There are a number of social impacts that are positive that are associated with deer. People like to spend time together and strengthen family and other group bonds when they collectively engage in activities like deer hunting. It can have very positive social benefits. People also, I think DEC estimates that hunters take about 220,000 deer annually, and that fills freezers with about 10.8 million pounds of high-quality venison. And that's a great deal of food, and that food is often shared at family meals, community game dinners, or is donated to food pantries through programs like the Venison Donation Coalition. So in those ways, the social impacts of deer can be very positive. But there can also be negative social impacts, specifically when there are conflicts between people over the management of deer. Some people thinking that deer numbers should be higher, some people thinking deer numbers should be lower. And in New York, these kinds of conflicts have emerged across the state in areas like Buffalo and Rochester, in central New York, for example, Cayuga Heights in Tompkins County, and in downstate areas like Westchester County and Long Island communities. There are also psychological impacts associated with deer, both positive and negative. So the positive impacts can be the things like the satisfaction that one gets through the recreation that occurs around deer hunting, and also just the positive psychological impacts of or effects associated with being out in nature and spending time outdoors. But there are also negative effects like frustration that your garden plants have been eaten, or anxiety over potentially contracting Lyme disease, or the fear of hitting a deer with your vehicle, for example. And then there are health and safety impacts. There are positive health impacts to spending time in nature and in pursuit of any animal, or if you're out conducting nature photography or just out taking a walk hoping to see deer. Just spending time outdoors and in the forest has positive health benefits like boosting your immune system or lowering your blood pressure, improving sleep and increasing energy levels. So there can be positive health effects of deer hunting, for example. But there can also be negative health and safety impacts. For example, Lyme disease is a major concern that people express, and also concern over collisions with deer car collisions. In the United States, there's been quite a big increase in the number of Lyme disease cases reported over the last couple of decades. And we're now to a point in 2013 that over 35,000 cases, either confirmed or probable, were reported. So it has become a serious issue in the United States. And New York is no exception. We had a peak of Lyme disease cases in 2008 with well over 5,000 cases, but there continue to be thousands of reported cases in New York State each year. Deer can also have some positive economic impacts. Expenditures for hunting and other deer-related activities generates a lot of positive economic effects. Many communities welcome the economic impact that's associated with hunter purchases of food and fuel and lodging and equipment, and deer hunting is often regarded as a significant positive benefit, especially in rural areas of the state. And according to DEC, each year more than 500,000 deer hunters contribute nearly $690 million to New York State's economy through hunting-related expenses and through license purchases and federal excise taxes that hunters generate, over $35 million to support management activities of DEC. So that's quite a positive economic benefit. In terms of negative economic impacts, they come in many different forms. One example would be the impact to homeowners in their landscape plants and in their home gardens, either their vegetable gardens or flower gardens. That can have a pretty serious impact. And then there's also agricultural impacts and the economic damage that's done there. In a 2002 grower survey of deer damage to agriculture in New York State agricultural regions, and I showed the regions here. So the Central Finger Lakes aggregate unit kind of occurs at the intersection of the western, central, and southern tier agricultural units, just so you know when we move to the next slide. So when we look at those units, the reported deer damage by region was $20.4 million in western New York, $7.7 million in the southern tier, and $7.5 million in central New York. So that was in 2002 numbers, so one might expect that to be higher in today's dollars. And the total estimate of statewide deer damage was $58.8 million, with grain crops suffering the greatest amount of damage, $13.6 million in total damage, followed by nursery products and then tree fruits. Now, some of those impacts, like if deer eat your garden plants, or deer are feeding on agricultural crops, or if you have a deer car collision, those are very obvious impacts. But ecological impacts can be a little more subtle and a little more difficult to recognize and to understand. So specifically, deer can have a pretty significant impact on our forests and the health of our forests. And a lot of things make for a healthy forest, but the two things that I'm going to talk about related to deer are two indicators of healthy forest are a variety of native plant and tree species are able to grow there, and the forest is able to grow a new forest or regenerate in the case of a disturbance. And that can either be a natural disturbance where trees fall over and the canopy kind of opens up, or a timber harvest where there's kind of a more purposeful removal of the canopy. The Nature Conservancy did a study in 2010 where they looked at the amount of regeneration or predicted regeneration of desirable timber species in New York State. So essentially asking the question, across the state, how well are we doing, or what's the likelihood that we would be able to regenerate desirable timber species? And this is really important, not only economically, because timber species really support a good portion of our economy, but also because those same species that are good for timber, things like oak and maple, also happen to be very desirable wildlife food species. So when you look at the Central Finger Lakes aggregate unit toward the center of the state, you can see that it's kind of a mishmash of different effects. There's some positive areas, so anything that's green is very good or good regeneration being predicted. Anything that's orange or red is fair or poor. And you can see that there are quite a few areas in the central part of the state that look like they might be fair or poor. So it looks somewhat variable in that region, but it looks like there can be a lot of challenges to regrowing a new forest in many of those parts. In a survey that Cornell conducted of practicing foresters in 2009, the foresters were asked of the stands that they visited, what percent would they consider to have highly successful regeneration, moderately successful regeneration, marginally successful regeneration, or a complete failure. And across the state, 45% of the stands they reported to be marginally successful, and 25% were a complete failure. And when they asked foresters what the reasons for the marginal or failed forest regeneration were, according to their own expertise and experience, deer browsing came up as the number one reason that they felt that regrowing new forests, regrowing new seedlings was not taking place, with interfering vegetation being second. So how do deer affect the forest? They affect the forest in a number of different ways. They can change the forest structure. So this picture here is probably, one of the more obvious signs. You can see that some sunlight is reaching the forest floor, but there's absolutely no vegetation or no seedlings growing on the forest floor. It's kind of devoid of those layers, the shrub layer and the understory layer. No seedlings are growing there, and that's a clear sign that deer are having a big impact. When you look at a picture of a forest like this one, it's a little bit more subtle. You can see a lot of ferns growing on the forest floor, and there is a forest there, and aesthetically it looks pretty pleasing. And so you might look at that and think that that forest is in fine condition, until you see that forest is part of an overall forest stand that looks like this on the right-hand side. So the only difference between the right-hand side of this slide and the left-hand side of the slide is that deer have been kept out or excluded from the right-hand side by a fence. And so you can see what's happened over time is that by feeding on the seedlings that have tried to grow up, they've eliminated seedlings or any kind of tree or shrub growth from 5 or 6 feet down to the forest floor. So when you look out on the left-hand side of the slide, you don't see anything growing up, basically up to the height where deer can reach, versus the right-hand side of the slide where there's a healthy number of seedlings growing up in the understory of that forest. So in addition to the structure of the forest, deer can also affect influence the kinds of plants growing in the forest. So this is a list of generally high preference species, species of trees and shrubs that deer prefer to eat, and then low preference species on the right. And so by feeding on the things that they really like, they tend to exclude those species from a forest. And then those low preference species, things like American beech or hop hornbeam or striped maple, tend to kind of grow and take over the forest. A lot of studies have shown that deer can influence the habitat of other wildlife species too by the amount of browsing they do and eliminating some of those layers of forest. For example, one study in Allegheny National Forest showed that as deer density increases, so as you have more deer per square mile, you have fewer songbirds. And deer can also have a long-lasting effect on their own habitat, the quality and quantity of habitat that's available to them. So by browsing heavily, if there are too many deer for the forest to support, they can do some pretty significant damage to the food that might be available to them in the future, both the amount and the quality of the food that will be available for deer. So when communities or wildlife agencies focus on managing deer-related impacts, like those that I just described, key roles for wildlife researchers and managers include things like identifying and raising awareness of deer-related effects, and also increasing the public understanding of the way the interconnections between the ecological and social components in a deer management system. And then stakeholders, people who live in the area and have experienced the effects of deer, either positive or negative, or sometimes some of both. Those stakeholders have a key role as well, and those roles include identifying how they're affected by deer and identifying which of those effects are important enough to receive management attention. So which effects should actually be considered impacts that need to be managed, and again, either positive or negative. And so the best tool is asking why. The first focus should be on establishing the goals. Why do you want deer management to occur? What impacts are serious enough to warrant action? And then thinking about how to manage comes later. So the first step, again, is establishing the goals and the why to manage. This pilot effort is really focused on that part, the asking why, identifying deer effects and impacts, and engaging stakeholders in the Central Finger Lakes unit in going through that process to identify those goals. And there are 3 basic steps that are being taken. The first was a survey of citizens within the Central Finger Lakes aggregate unit that was conducted last year, and the next presentation will focus on the results of that survey. The second is a questionnaire for webinar participants like yourselves and anyone else who's interested in completing it online. And that information will supplement the information from the survey. And then the third step is gaining further input from a small group of stakeholders through what's called a stakeholder input group. And we'll also be giving you more information later this evening. If you're interested in being part of that group that gives some additional input, we'll let you know what steps to take. Okay, so now I would like to open up a poll. I'm going to make a poll available to all of you, and the poll has about 9 questions. And so we're just going to take a 5-minute break for you all to complete the poll, and we'll see what deer impacts you have experienced, positive and negative, and kind of share that information with one another. So at this point, if you can see the poll, go right ahead and fill it out, and we'll come back at 7:31 and review those results. All right, thank you everyone for completing the poll. So we'll take a look at the results here. Okay, it looks like most people who are participating this evening live in a rural area, not on a farm. Some live in a village or hamlet or a small city. Almost everyone, a large percentage, 42 out of 55 people who completed the poll said they enjoy seeing or photographing deer. I would be included in that group. A majority of people say they have experienced deer damage to their home, vegetable, or flower garden. Over half of the people participating tonight enjoy deer hunting with friends or family or on their own. And about 17 people have experienced damage to crops or fruit trees, so less than half of the group here tonight. Fortunately, not many people, only 10 out there, have hit a deer with their car in the last 3 years, and so that's good to hear. Not many people who are on this evening benefit economically from in their jobs or their businesses from money people spend while deer hunting, though some do, about 4. Oh wow, 28 out of 55 people have either themselves or family member, friend, or pet who's contracted Lyme disease. Wow, and 43 out of 55 people say that in their woodland or a woodland nearby, they've noticed that deer have browsed tree seedlings. So that's very interesting. So thank you everyone for completing that and for sharing that with the group. Next up, we're going to have Bill Seymour. Bill is going to present on the survey that was conducted within the Central Finger Lakes Management Unit. And Bill, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I am.
All right. Well, with that, you can take it away. I'm going to hand over the controls to you.
Very good. Well, good evening, everyone. As Christy mentioned, I'm Bill Seymour. I'm with the Human Dimensions Research Unit at Cornell, and I want to take a few minutes to go over the results of the survey with you. This survey was designed and implemented by myself and others at Cornell, and it was sponsored by DEC. The purpose of the survey was to provide 4 kinds of baseline information on residents in this management unit. Specifically, our objectives were to characterize residents' interest in and concerns about local deer, their experiences with deer and perceptions related to deer and various kinds of human interactions with deer, their opinions on how important it is to manage various types of human-deer interactions, and their overall attitude toward deer and perception of the cost-benefit ratio associated with presence of deer in their local area. If you were on the webinar last week, you heard Art mention that DEC has divided or partitioned the state into 25 wildlife management unit aggregates, and they're represented by different colors on this map. And the Central Finger Lakes Management Unit, which we studied, is there in the middle of the state, indicated by that pink area. This aggregate includes several counties, including Wayne, Ontario, Seneca, Cayuga, Schuyler, and Tompkins. We randomly surveyed a sample of 1,000 households with listed telephone numbers in each of the 3 wildlife management units in the aggregate. So in the west, we sampled 1,000 households in 8J on the west side of Seneca Lake, another 1,000 in 8S there in the south, and another 1,000 in the east on the eastern side of Cayuga Lake, for a total of 3,000. Cornell and DC staff collaborated to develop an 8-page self-administered questionnaire shown here, and it contained 46 questions that addressed all of our study objectives. We implemented survey mailings between March and April of last year, and we contacted each member of the sample up to 4 times. A few weeks after the mail survey concluded, we worked with Cornell's Survey Research Institute to complete a total of 228 follow-up interviews with survey non-respondents. Residents returned 1,456 questionnaires, shown in the yellow there, and that totals to a 51% response rate after undeliverable questionnaires are deleted. You can see in the bottom of this table a weighting factor. We weighted the responses based on the wildlife management unit in which respondents lived. And you can see that 8J received the heaviest weight, and that's because over half of residents live in that part of the aggregate. Now, with that brief overview of the study methods, I'd like to share a few results with you. The numbers I'll share, again, are weighted by region of residence, but we decided not to adjust for non-response. In the interest of time, I won't get into that now, but more on that is available in the written report. So first, I'd like to share findings on deer-related interests in deer and concerns about deer. Then I'll talk with you a bit about findings on experiences with deer and perceptions related to deer. I'll follow that with some information on the interactions that respondents believe are important enough to receive more management attention in this unit. And finally, I'll end with some findings that paint a picture of collective tolerance for deer-related impacts in the study area. So, beginning with interests. This is a summary of interests with responses collapsed into 3 categories. So on the left are the folks who were not at all interested, in the middle are those who were slightly or moderately interested, and then on the right are those who are very or extremely interested in these things. Overall, you can see that the presence of local deer was perceived quite positively by many respondents. A majority reported that they were very interested in knowing that deer populations in their local area were healthy and doing well. Many were very interested in seeing deer in their local area or seeing deer near their home. And you can see at the bottom of the table that fewer respondents expressed a strong interest in photographing deer or hunting deer, although those are still fairly strong. This slide summarizes concerns about local deer, again with responses collapsed into 3 categories. And in this table, on the left are folks who are not at all concerned. In the middle column are those who are slightly or moderately concerned. And those on the right are very or extremely concerned about these issues. You can see that most residents had some concerns about negative impacts associated with deer. And the highest level of concern related to interactions that threaten human health and safety. So in other words, highest concerns are about contracting Lyme disease or incurring injuries from a deer-car collision, with the next highest level of concern being related to negative impacts of deer on native plants or wildlife habitat or plant and animal diversity. And the lowest levels of concern being problems associated with hunters or hunting or damage to plants around the home. We also asked folks if they had any other kinds of concerns, and so this is an open-ended question. We used this to see if there were any categories of interests or concerns that we didn't cover in closed-ended items. And one thing that often happens in these kinds of surveys is folks sometimes give us responses that we already covered in the closed-ended items, and that's what you see here in this column. These are things that so at the top of this list here, you see that problems with hunters or opposition with hunting were most commonly mentioned there, and followed by deer vehicle collisions being another common category. And looking at this right column, the column in white, these are things that did fall into new categories of interest or concern, things that weren't mentioned in the closed-ended items. So topping that list was interest in controlling the size of the deer population, or hunter interest in seeing specific changes to deer hunting regulations. And then you can see a list of other miscellaneous types of interests or concerns mentioned by just a few people. Many respondents engaged in activities or had experiences that exposed them to negative interactions with local deer. For example, 67% of respondents had gardens or ornamental trees and shrubs that might be browsed by deer, and 46% of respondents had experienced damage to those kind of plantings. 58% of respondents said they often drive in areas with deer, and 39% of respondents said they'd experienced a deer-related vehicle accident or DRVA. 25% of respondents said they owned woodlots, and 8% of respondents said they'd experienced damage to those kinds of woodlots. And 12% of respondents owned farmland, and 11% of respondents said they'd experienced some kind of crop damage. We asked residents to report whether they believed a set of 9 different types of human-deer interactions had increased, decreased, or stayed about the same in the area over the last 5 years. And you can see in this table a mix of experiences. So looking at the top row there, about 22% of people said the number of deer they see around their home had decreased. About 42% said it had stayed the same, and 32% said it had increased. And similarly, in the other 2 items there, there's a mix of experiences, with some people experiencing decreases in interactions, others experiencing an increase. But in any case, you can see all of these folks most of them can give us an opinion on this or have some perspective on this. In contrast, when we asked about a range of other kinds of human-deer interactions, you can see in the far right column there that a good number of people were uncertain whether there'd been any change at all and in what direction. So, for example, in the top of the list there, you can see that about 1/3 of respondents thought the rate of deer vehicle collisions had increased in the last 5 years, but another 1/3 didn't know whether the collision rate was increasing or decreasing. And as you go lower in the table, you can see the degree of uncertainty gets even higher. For instance, over half of people were really not sure how cases of Lyme disease had changed over time. We also asked respondents to identify the deer-related concerns they thought were most important to address in their area. And again, these are collapsed into a couple of categories, so not at all important, slightly to moderately important, or very or extremely important. Residents were most likely to report that it was very important to them that health and safety issues be addressed, including deer health and well-being. Fewer respondents said it was very important to address crop damage, damage to natural plants, or damage to plantings near homes. Okay, and finally we asked 2 questions that provide an indication of overall tolerance for deer and deer-related problems in this area. One indicator of tolerance is a person's overall attitude toward deer, and another is whether a person believes the costs of having deer in their community exceed the benefits of having those deer present. These are really highly correlated items, and they're intended to measure the same concept, tolerance. For many years, we've been asking this kind of a question on our deer management surveys. We want to know if people enjoy deer unconditionally, whether they enjoy deer but worry about problems associated with deer, or whether they simply regard deer as a nuisance. And in this area, we found that about 1 in 3 respondents, 32%, unconditionally enjoyed deer and didn't worry about deer-related problems. over half of respondents enjoy deer but worried about the problems deer may cause, and fewer than 10% said they do not enjoy deer and regard them as a nuisance. And you can see that in Unit 8J, folks were more likely than those in the other units to enjoy deer without worry. The finding that over half of respondents indicated that they enjoy deer, even though they worry about deer-related problems, suggests that experience with deer-related problems is within tolerable levels for a majority of residents in this unit. We also asked residents how they perceive the relationship between costs and benefits of the deer population in their area, and I've shown the results to you here by the individual units, with 7H being represented by the black, and 8S by white, and HJ by the gray bars. Overall, we found that about half of the respondents, 53% in the whole aggregate, believe that the costs and benefits of deer in their area were about an even trade-off. That's the middle set of bars. 1 in 5 respondents believe the benefits of local deer outweighed the costs. That's the bars on the left. And then about 1 in 4 respondents, or 27% in the entire aggregate, believe the costs associated with local deer outweighed the benefits. And you can see that in Unit 7H, residents were most likely to think the costs exceeded the benefits. And that's not surprising, given that we know that there are a few communities in that unit that have where tolerance has been exceeded for many residents for a number of years. We took a closer look at interest in deer among residents who had different perceptions of the relationship between deer-related costs and benefits. Here and so you can see in the left column we have only those respondents who thought benefits exceeded costs, and in the right column are only respondents who thought costs exceeded benefits. Those are the numbers shown in red. And here we've ordered interest from greatest to least for those who believe the costs exceeded the benefits. So overall, these results show that respondents who believe costs exceed benefits are less interested than other respondents in all of these kinds of things. And conversely, when we look at concerns, again, comparing folks who think costs, or comparing folks who say benefits exceed costs to those who say costs exceed benefits, we see that the respondents who believe costs exceed benefits are more concerned about all of these areas, and they're especially concerned about health and safety impacts like injuries and the possibility of contracting disease. Residents who believe costs exceeded benefits were most likely to report that it was very important to them that managers address these top things here, human health and safety issues. But they also were interested in having managers address crop damage and damage to landscaping and native or natural plants. And all of these findings suggest that managing any of these negative impacts could increase overall tolerance for deer in this Finger Lakes unit. So, what are the next steps in this unit? Well, I think Christy's going to go over this with us next, but in general, there's going to be a small group process with area residents, and that process will be sponsored by DEC and facilitated by lots of the folks who were involved in the webinar this evening. And those deliberations and other information will be used to establish local objectives for deer management. I know I went over all of this quickly, but for anyone who's interested in more information and more on the results, the full report is available on the website that Christy mentioned earlier in our first webinar, and we're here to answer any questions you may have about the data. So thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Bill, and I'm going to try to give some of those details to people right now. Bill mentioned the website, and so I just want to put up the website address on this slide, but I will send a follow-up email to this webinar just as I did with the last one, and I'll include this web link again. But on this website, we have a collection of presentations. We have them there as the PowerPoint presentations and PDFs of the PowerPoint presentations, and each presentation is recorded separately as a recording that has been posted to YouTube. So in some cases, we have one on deer damage to agriculture, for example, and healthy forests, healthy deer is another separate one that are more detailed, more lengthy presentations than what you heard tonight, and also go into ways to try to mediate some of those impacts. So there are a lot of resources on the website. We have also posted the recording of the first webinar, the entire webinar, on that website, and I will post the recording of this webinar as well. So if you want to share the links to the webinars, they'll be there, and I'll also be sending that out in an email. All the publications that were mentioned during last week's presentation that Art gave, so he put up a slide with some images about community-based deer management and some other deer management publications. We've put those up at someone's request last week, so they're up on the website, and as Bill mentioned, the results of the survey that he just went over are also there. We also are going to have links to a supplemental survey that you all can complete, and that's combined with an evaluation of this webinar. So we will make that available to you, and if you could complete it, we would really appreciate it. We'd love to have your feedback on how you found the information that was presented here, and we'd really love to have your feedback. And we also will have a link to the application to be part of the stakeholder input group, which I'll give a little more information on in just a second, but that will also be on the website. So the website is pretty comprehensive. In terms of the stakeholder input group that Bill just mentioned, the stakeholder input group, again, is going to be a small group of interested citizens who will provide feedback to DEC about deer impacts in the Central Finger Lakes WMU aggregate. It's going to consist of 12 individuals who can reflect a variety of interests and characteristics of people living in the Central Finger Lakes aggregate, including people who enjoy seeing deer or are concerned about Lyme disease, own forested land, hunters, people who farm, or people who simply spend a lot of time driving in areas with deer. So pretty much anyone with an interest or in deer or who's been affected by deer in some way is welcome to fill out the form to participate. So the goal for composition of the stakeholder input group will be to try to gather a cross-section of informed, thoughtful people who can reflect a broad scope of interests in deer and deer management. And then the requirements to participate in the stakeholder input group are that you must live in the Central Finger Lakes aggregate unit, and you have to be available on the primary dates. There'll be 2 different evening meetings from 7 to 9 p.m. The first, right now, the hopeful dates are March 1st and March 15th, but there are also snow dates of March 3rd and March 17th. So you'd have to be available on all 4 of those dates in case it snows. From 7 to 9 p.m. And the location has not been determined exactly yet, but we're shooting for a location somewhere in Ovid, which would be more or less centrally located within the aggregate. So the other requirements are that to participate, you have to have attended both webinars or view them online before you apply. So you can listen to the recordings of the webinars if you weren't available to, to participate in person in one or the other, or even both. If you know of someone else who has an interest but wasn't able to register in time or for some other reason couldn't participate, they could still fill out the form. And the forms have to be completed by February 5th, and I think this is a really important point because February 5th is only a week from this Friday. So if you're planning to fill out the form, please complete it as soon as possible. if you are interested, Emily has put a link in the chat box to all participants to both to the Stakeholder Input Group application. So you could click on it before you leave the webinar tonight. You could click on that link and fill it out right away. Or again, it'll be posted to the website, and I also will send you that link in an email probably on Friday of this week. And last but not least, the webinar evaluation and the supplemental survey. If you'd like to give input to the survey information and you didn't receive the mail survey, you have the opportunity to contribute. And same as the SIG application, you can, Emily has put the link in the chat box right now, and I'll also email it to you and post it on the website. All right, so at this time, I'd like to open it up to questions again. If anybody has questions, feel free to type them into the chat box if you have questions about the survey for Bill, if you have questions about last week's presentations. But again, please confine it to the topics that we've discussed here. If you have questions about other topics like local deer abundance outside the Central Finger Lakes aggregate, or deer hunting regulations like season dates and DMP quotas, buck management, hunting implement issues, etc. You can ask those here, and actually some people asked some off-topic questions last week, things they were really interested in, and Courtney and Art took the time to complete answers to those and send them to me today. So I'm going to be contacting some individuals with answers to their other questions by the end of the week. But for now, if you could confine it to anything discussed during the webinars, that would be great. And so at this time, if you have any questions, please do type them in. I have a question here from Jacqueline. Jacqueline asks, where was the study done that showed reduced songbird abundance correlated with increased deer densities, and could you provide a citation? And yes, that study was done at Allegheny National Forest in northern Pennsylvania, and there have been a number of studies since that original study looking at the long-term effects of having high deer densities. 20 years after that study was completed, they're still seeing some long-term effects in the number of songbirds and also the diversity of wildflower species growing in the forest, and actually the amount of caterpillars in the forest, so bird food. And so I can send that out with the email, the follow-up email that I send out later this week. Let's see, there's a question from Sharon's group. Will the same SIG members be involved for only this year or for multiple years in the future? So what's the time commitment for a SIG group? And let's see, Art, would you like to answer that?
Sure. I think the plan would be to have individuals serve for one term, so to speak, and each SIG that's convened for a different aggregate or for the same aggregate in the future would try to seek out different folks.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, a question just came in. Is the supplemental survey the same questions as the survey that Bill did? It's a subset. Bill, can you answer? Maybe you could answer this. But I believe it's a subset of the questions that were asked. But the full answer, or the full data is available online, right?
Yes, yes. That does appear to be more or less a subset of the kinds of questions we explored in the larger resident survey, but the response categories are there are more response categories, and the questions are more fleshed out, and there are certainly more of them in the questionnaire. But they're getting at some of the same topics or impacts. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Somebody in AIDS group asks, Bill, did the survey take into account there are more cars in the last 10 years on the road, therefore more deer-to-car collisions?
Well, the survey is a survey of residents' perceptions. So perceptions can differ from actual incidents of whatever it is you're talking about. So it's important that survey results are not the only indicators of those impacts, but there's some effort to look into police records or something else to, kind of document what the actual impacts are and what people's perceptions of those impacts are, and do both of those, not one without the other necessarily.
Okay, thank you. Courtney, we have a question about someone noticed that, I believe it says they noticed that deer were covered in ticks in 2014, and in 2015 the tick infestation seemed to be much lower. Do you have any thoughts on this or on the cause?
I don't have any. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
We noticed that anecdotally when we were in deer shops during the hunting season collecting biological information on deer carcasses. And, there are different things that drive tick populations. There's a lot of research done about, how tick populations can follow fluctuations in rodent populations and things like that. So I don't have any specific knowledge on what happened this year or if tick densities were in fact lower than last year. But I can just say in Region 7, anecdotally, we noticed that in some places too.
Okay, thank you. The next question from someone in AIDS group again was, since hunters are, being, a population management tool, will input into the SIG from hunters be segregated into different implements that they use, so bow, gun, and muzzleloader hunters?
I can answer that. I don't know as if we're going to try to seek out different groups of hunters like that. I think the idea this time around, in difference to the first iteration of this process, I think we're going to ask each member of the SIG to look at a little more holistically, I guess, and not just confine their comments or their information seeking to just one particular stake. So hopefully any person that would represent hunting or partly represent hunting is their broad interest on the group would look at all implements and try to collect information and form an opinion based on all information. So to answer your question, I don't think we're going to go out and seek out muzzleloader hunters and then seek out bow hunters and then seek out rifle hunters. I think we're going to look at it more holistically.
Okay, thank you, Art. Someone asked the question, what would deer density have to be in relation to forest area to prevent regrowth damage or allow regrowth? And I think the answer to that question is always it depends. So it would depend on the quality of habitat and the available forage, other forage in an area. So, for example, in areas where there's a lot of vegetation available, it might be able to, a higher quality habitat with more food, it might be able to support more deer before you would see significant damage. Or in places with really fertile soils where tree seedlings could grow more quickly and escape the browsing by deer, then maybe it could support more deer. So it's really on a locality by locality basis, and it depends a lot on what other foods are available and the general quality of the habitat.
Can I mention something, Christy?
Yeah, sure.
The damages to forests and deer damage in general is on a continuum. It's not such a thing that deer damage is intolerable, and then all of a sudden you reach a level of deer density where things all of a sudden become rosy. So it's important to know that not only are damage thresholds different from area to area, but it's on a continuum in any area you're looking at.
Yes, thank you very much, Art. Someone asks, will the stakeholder input group be provided with other actual data in addition to the survey information, so the opinions of the people who completed the survey, to supplement the data on perceptions? So I'm assuming it means, you know, things like actual data on other impacts.
Well, I'd certainly like to show up at the first meeting, SIG meeting, with a whole bunch of information, hard data that we have collected on deer populations in the aggregate. So the answer is yes. I'd like to provide a bunch of other data in addition to the survey data.
Okay. Somebody is wondering what has been the deer density in the aggregate area in the last decade.
I could answer that. Just give me a second. I can talk on it. I don't have the data by aggregate, but I have it by WMU.
Okay. Do you want me to go to another question and come back to you, Art?
Sure. Why don't you do that?
Okay. Let's see. Bill, somebody asks, can you go into a bit more detail on how the survey list was generated? We have several questions. Why weight dense areas heavier than others? Why not ask more people after the 51% response rate? And is the phone book methodology dated? And let me know if you want me to repeat those individual parts.
Yeah, Christy, I was not getting all of the audio on some of that question. So, yeah, if you could repeat it, and especially the first part I didn't hear.
Okay. So the general question was whether you could go into a bit more detail on how the survey list was generated. So why dense areas were weighted more heavily than others, and why you didn't ask more people after you reached the 51% response rate, why not go beyond that, and whether or not the phone book methodology is dated.
Okay, well, the sampling method we used was of listed households, and that methodology does exclude people who don't have listed telephone numbers. So some portion of the population is excluded with that method. So there are pros and cons with that. The other main method that people use to try to reach everyone in a population is called address-based sampling, or ABS sampling, and that's drawn from Postal Service records of addresses. So that gets something like 98% of the households. So that gets more of the households in a population, but the downside of that sampling method is that it doesn't come with actual names. And so all of those questionnaires and that kind of an approach have to be addressed to the resident. And there are two problems with that. We find if we send something to a resident addressed to a dear resident, the response rate is usually quite poor. And another problem is we have no information to use to contact people for a non-respondent follow-up interview. So there are pros and cons with each of those methods. We selected the listed household sample because we thought it was better for this particular application. I'm not quite sure. Maybe you can rephrase for me one more time, Christy. I may be forgetting it. I don't understand the question about what we did after receiving a 51% response.
Yes, the question is stated, why not ask more people after a 51% response rate? So I'm not exactly sure what's meant by that, but maybe why didn't you go out and survey additional people, to get more people's input, since you didn't get, you know, a larger response rate?
Well, I guess there's sort of two responses to that. There are limited budgets for any given study, so it's not possible to replicate the study again because we used up all the budget, you know, and in any case we'd sample to the limits of the budget and what's reasonable. And then the non-respondent follow-up interviews are also conducted to see if there are major differences. In this case, we did see some significant differences between respondents and non-respondents, but we didn't think it warranted weighting based on that. So we didn't do that, and I can explain more to that person in a follow-up conversation or email. And then there was one more portion to this question, and I've lost track of that one as well.
Okay, there was another part that said how many responses were there from 7H.
Let's see. Trying to quickly flip back to my report copy here.
Shall I come back to you?
No, the responses from 7H, 496, so 52% response.
Okay. So 496 people altogether.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Christy, I could answer that question now, I think.
All right, thank you, Art.
I think that the question related to the history, the deer population history in those 3 units that make up the aggregate. Is that basically correct?
Let's see, I'm going to go back and find that. Over 10 years. Let's see.
I think it would be good information, even if it wasn't a question, to
okay,
talk
go
about
ahead,
this.
yeah.
And it certainly will be information that we provide to the SIG. I have information in front of me on my computer going back 12 years, starting in 2003, up through the last year for which we have complete harvest data, which would have been the 2014 year. Keep in mind that the New York State DEC indexes deer populations a couple ways, but one of the main ways is by looking at the harvest of adult males in the hunting season. So we use that as an index of the total population. And so each one of the 3 units has a buck take objective set for it that we try, that is our goal to try to keep the population to. Well, let's start out with, just because it's first here on my screen, 8J has a buck harvest objective of 2.1 bucks per square mile. Now that doesn't mean the population is 2.1 bucks, but when the harvest is counted at the end of the season, our goal is that 2.1 bucks per square mile have been taken in the harvest. So for the first half of that 12-year period, we did quite well. It was the buck take hovered just over and at the objective through 2008. It bounced around just above and right on it, actually. And starting in 2008, it started a steady increase up through 2013, where it hit the high of 3.3 bucks per square mile. Last year, well, I should say 2014, it took a little downward turn down to 2.9. So it's been above objective since 2009. I would expect that it's probably going to go down a little bit, as many of our units might this year because of a tough winter last winter, but it'll probably still be above objective. Moving on to 8S, that's kind of a little different. We had actually 2 buck take objectives. One, the first half of the period, was at 4.2 bucks per square mile, and the actual buck take was quite a bit below that for that entire time. It ranged around a whole buck less. It was in 3.4 down to 2.7 in that range. So it was chronically below our objective up until 2009, when a new objective was selected. That new objective was 2.9 or I'm sorry, 2.8 bucks per square mile. So the objective was lowered quite a bit, and now all of a sudden the objective, or the actual population was above the objective. So now we have been slightly above objective for the last 6 years or so. In 2014 came in just about right where we wanted it to, 2.9 bucks. So we currently are right on target in 8S. In 7H, there as well, there's been 2 objectives over the past 12 years. The first one was 2.8 bucks per square mile up until 2006 or so, and the actual buck take was right around that same level. So we did quite well the first 4 or 5 years. Then in 2007, the buck take objective was lowered to 1.9. Apparently the Citizen Task Force that was convened back whenever thought that the deer population was too high, and so they wanted to see it lower. But unfortunately, the deer didn't play ball, and that deer population was steadily increasing all the way to 2012. It's gone down a couple, the last 2 years a little bit, but it's still been above objective since 2007. So that's a little snapshot of the 3 units.
Okay, thank you, Art. Let's see, this is a question that we had come up last week as well. And Art, I think you fielded this one. And we did have, so the questions that were asked last week that did pertain to the topics that were discussed, we've put together in a frequently asked questions handout, and we will make that available on the website as well. So you'll be able to see written answers, written responses to the questions. So look for that too in the upcoming week. But the question, Art, was what are the advantages of combining into an aggregate area?
Well, the advantages are a couple. One, it's more efficient for us to work with aggregates because there's 92 wildlife management units, but only 25 aggregates. So right off the bat, it by almost a third or a quarter, I guess, reduces the amount of legwork we would have to do versus a WMU basis. But the main reason is one of gathering data because some of our units don't have adequate harvest data in the way of deer check data. Sometimes we go out and maybe there's just not enough deer processors out there to collect the data that we need. Manpower is often an issue as well. But so if we have a unit that doesn't have sufficient sample size, we benefit by putting units together into these aggregates. So we can now have enough sample size so we can have statistically valid harvest estimates. That's basically one of statistical need, I guess. We want to be able to have faith in the harvest estimates.
Okay, thank you. Bill, I have a question here about the survey. And the question is, why even question households in cities?
Well, we're looking for a representation of all of the deer management stakeholders in the unit and their deer management stakeholders.
Okay. Thank you very much. Somebody has a question. Art, last week you discussed different management options, deer management options, and the focus groups were mentioned, and someone wants to know, there's kind of 2 questions that are somewhat similar. One is asking specifically about the focal area in Tompkins County and whether that seems effective. And another one is just general, are deer being successfully reduced where the problems are most prevalent?
Well, Courtney could probably tackle the focus area question better than I, since it's in her region.
Okay.
But in general, deer damage or deer management can be successful in certain areas, and in some areas it's not. I mean, it goes to the number of hunters that are available, the number of hunters that want to take part. Land access certainly comes into it. So I guess you'd have to be more specific as far as what particular area you're talking about. But we're constantly looking for new ways to be able to meet our management goals, that's for sure.
And I can just speak briefly about the focus area. You know, it's succeeded on a couple of fronts for us as an agency. Tompkins County in Region 7 was receiving kind of a disproportionate number of nuisance permit requests for farmers before the focus area was created. And since the focus area was created, those requests have gone down. And so have our requests, obviously, for DMAP permits, which allows extra antlerless tags during the hunting season. That's obviously not needed anymore in the focus area. As far as actual harvest numbers and crunching data from hunter-submitted harvest logs, that's something that we're still compiling and analyzing, and hopefully shortly we'll be ready to share that with the public and evaluate the program in the next couple of years. But we're still studying that right now.
Okay, thank you, Courtney. There's another question that you might be able to answer, which was, what was the winter kill percentage last year? Or last winter?
Sure. You know, we don't have a hard percentage of winter kill, but we use a couple of different kind of clues to help us estimate the impact that the winter had on the deer population. One of the things we did in Region 7 last year, which we always try to do, but is get out whenever we had a call come in about suspected winter mortality. So staff in our office went out and checked on those deer to determine if it was winter starvation. And we were able to get out to all of the calls that came into us last winter, that, you know, the ones we knew about. And the cases we confirmed that were winter starvation were all fawns. So at least the cases we looked at, the winter wasn't severe enough to start taking yearling animals. The other thing we look at is winter severity index. So that's something that's created by looking at the number of days when the snow depth was 15 inches or higher, because that impedes deer movement. The other thing we look at is the number of days at or below 0 degrees. And so that's for deer management, that's called a winter severity index. And so that gives us another idea based on the severity of that rating, kind of what hit that would have to the deer population. And even though it was a bad winter, especially bad winter for us, speaking on the scale of a wildlife management unit, in most of the units in our region, it was rated as a moderate winter as far as deer go. Of course, that'll vary, you know, based on where you are in that unit. If you're at a higher elevation, the winter will be more severe. You know, if you're in an area with less cover for the deer, it will be, you know, different impacts depending on kind of that really local scale. But that's kind of the way we look at our data and analyze, trying to figure out how many doe tags should be issued in the following year.
Okay, thank you. Someone else is asking for a clarification. Can you say again what will happen with the information collected during the SIG process? What influence will the group have? And then also somebody related to that asks if SIG groups are going to have an actual impact on future deer season dates and deer bag limits.
Yeah, I can answer that one. I'll start with the second part of that first. The SIG process is designed to only address deer populations sizes, not any other aspect of deer management like season dates or implements or tag availability or anything like that. So it's strictly population related, and it's based on what their SIG's perception is of current situations. So whatever they take information on or whatever they perceive as the current deer status or level in their areas, that's what they base their recommendation on, whether or not they would like to see 10% more, 20% less. And the first part of the question, I believe, had to do with how the SIG would actually work or something to that effect.
It was asking what will happen with the information collected during the SIG process. So what influence will that group have?
Yeah, well, the SIG group, the 12 individuals on the SIG yet to be selected, will use the survey data. They'll use information from this educational effort, the webinar, information that we provide, DEC provides as far as the nuts and bolts of deer management in the area. And they will deliberate and they will come to some kind of consensus as to the level of impacts and what impacts need to be placed above others. So they will prioritize the impacts in the aggregate, and they will decide which is most important to address, and they will collectively come to an agreement as to what they think the deer population in that aggregate should do. And then they will provide that to us. We will then, in turn, take that data or that input that's given to us, and we will see if that prescription, so to speak, is compatible with the existing ecological situation in that aggregate. So, for example, if the SIG recommended a very big increase in the deer population, but we think the ecology was already stressed to the max, then we would probably not fulfill the SIG's total prescription. We would use the ecological situation as a sideboard, in other words.
Okay, thank you. There's another question. Are there plans to expand the deer impacts to other areas, or is the Central Finger Lakes it? And I assume that means the collection of information on deer impacts.
Yeah, well, this is a pilot effort. We selected this aggregate. It was close to Cornell. It was, I guess that was the main reason, but we had to pick something to start with, and so we picked this one to start with. But the idea is that we will, at the conclusion of this process, apply any tweaks that we think are necessary to make the process better, and then if we think it worked as it was designed to, then we'll expand it to other aggregates. So there's 24 other aggregates in addition to the Central Finger Lakes, so we have our work cut out for us in that regard.
Okay, thank you. There was a question regarding the survey of foresters that I mentioned in terms of forest regeneration impacts that they were seeing, and someone wants to know if there were any foresters surveyed from Unit 7H. And Stefan, that was someone from your group, so if that person wants to contact me directly, I don't know that answer off the top of my head, but I can try to find out and provide that information. All right. There are a number of questions that have to do with issues outside of the webinar topics, so things like DMP quotas and regulations and buck management, like antler point restrictions and hunting implement issues. So Art and Courtney and Jeremy's emails are right up there on the slide. So if you'd like to write those down and contact them directly with those questions, you know, they've been very good at answering people's questions as they come in. And other than that, I think it's 8:30 now, and Art and Courtney and Jeremy have stuck around for 15 extra minutes, so it's probably time to go. But I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and feel free to complete the evaluation as well as the stakeholder input group form if you're interested. Feel free to complete those yet tonight or later on, and I'll be sending a follow-up email probably on Friday. If you have any additional questions, also feel free to contact me. So thanks to all our speakers for the both webinars and for everyone who helped to organize them, and thanks to all of you for participating. Have a good night.